Jeff Fort is a very cruel and inhuman man.
He's like a perfect angel to me.
To me, it stands for evil.
Jeff Fort was a very powerful human being.
He was pretty much a pipsqueak.
He is one of the rare human beings.
He got the taste of the easy life.
Obviously, he was a natural leader.
He reminded me of a very good, charismatic Baptist preacher.
He was very intelligent,
sophisticated leader engaged in criminal activities.
I never knew him to be a violent man.
He was engaged in the attempt to perform terrorist activities against the United States for money.
He'll always be the leader of the people.
If ever there's a person going to hell, Jeff is one of them.
Chicago. It is a dynamic, diverse, passionate city. It is a city of writers, poets, and politicians, murderers, drug dealers, and thugs. As a city, it has presided over the best of times, and it has suffered through the worst. The mid to late 1960s were among the worst of times, and one of the reasons was the gangs. In the 60s, the biggest, baddest gang of all was the Blackstone Rangers. One of its organizers was a skinny kid from Aberdeen, Mississippi, an unlikely-looking leader by the name of Jeff Fort, known from his earliest days on the street as Angel. In the 20 years that would follow, Jeff Fort would move from gang leader to interstate drug dealer to an historic criminal conviction for conspiring to commit domestic terrorism on behalf of the government of Libya. Through it all, Jeff Fort would remain the enigmatic, charismatic leader of a closed society. This is the story of Jeff Fort, of what he was and what he's come to be. But it's also the story of a Chicago community called Woodlawn and what happened to that community when it tried to combat the street gangs that were literally tearing it apart. A lot of things have changed in 20 years, but to this day, there remains a passionate argument over whether things could have turned out differently. A fierce debate over whether Jeff Fort or Woodlawn could have been saved. Today, Jeff Fort is 41 years old. At this moment, he lives in a maximum security cell in the basement of Cook County Jail, where he awaits trial for the murder of a drug dealer. But Jeff Fort's criminal history begins when he was just a kid, by almost all accounts, a strangely charismatic kid. He wasn't big, he wasn't educated. Never having gone beyond the 4th grade, he was, and to this day is, a functional illiterate. But Jeff Fort could do something his associates could not. Not only could he lead, he could endure. But in the beginning, he was just one of a number of leaders of a number of street gangs engaged in a war over turf. Jeff Fort's turf was Blackstone Avenue and 65th Street, where he grew up. And Jeff Fort's gang called themselves the Blackstone Rangers.
When I first encountered them, they were a group of very young kids, maybe 16, 17 years old, the leadership. They were involved in violence with the disciples.
The East Side Disciples and the Blackstone Rangers were the principal combatants. It was an insane time.
Absolutely insane time.
Father Tracy O'Sullivan was a newly ordained parish priest in the 60s.
It was a very violent situation. I mean, shooting and stabbings going on continually in that community.
Charles LaPaglia was a social worker at the First Presbyterian Church in Woodlawn.
A guy would get shot and somebody would say, well, he's an East Side disciple. And if you ask the disciples who did it, they might say it was so-and-so who's a Blackstone Ranger.
Commander Edward Buckney of the Chicago Police Department was a captain at the time. Had you as a police officer ever seen anything like that before?
No, never.
Officer Richard Peck, back in the 60s, was assigned to the brand new Gang Intelligence Unit formed to stop what the gangs had started citywide, but especially in Woodlawn.
Racial change, economic change, cultural change, and whatever other change you want to mention, and it was happening very rapidly.
In the midst of that changing neighborhood, then, came the gangs.
They grew out of that turmoil.
How old were you when you first knew Jeff Fort?
About 17.
And he was how old?
About 16.
And the way you met was how?
Well, we used to fight each other.
Kenny Morrow was a high-ranking member of the Egyptian Cobras.
We fought against each other for 4 years.
But the Egyptian Cobras couldn't beat the Blackstone Rangers, and if you couldn't beat them, in order to survive, you had to join. Ultimately, 21 gangs would join under the umbrella of the Blackstone Rangers. There would be a ruling council called the Main 21 and a new gang name, the Black P Stone Nation. Some would argue the P stood for power. The nation was 4,000 strong. There were some struggles over leadership, but in the end, it was Jeff Fort who emerged as the man in charge. Former social worker Charles LaPaglia.
I guess the overwhelming impression I have of Jeff Fort was that he was a very intelligent person, very insightful.
Police Commander Edward Buckney.
Our impression of Jeff back in the early days was that he was pretty much a pipsqueak, a sneak.
Father Tracy O'Sullivan.
Jeff Fort was a very powerful human being.
Former gang member Kenny Morrow.
For a man not to have no formal education and could lead that many people and run that many people's lives, I would have to say he's wise. We had more fear for him than anybody in the nation.
He was little, he was skinny.
A little skinny kid, but he carried big guns. 9mm's always been his favorite.
In the late 60s, it was bloody in Woodlawn. Jeff Fort's Black P Stone Nation and the East Side Disciples were the reason.
There were 8 disciples shot on that corner in that year.
On this corner here, 65th and Woodlawn.
This was the Gaza Strip. And
this was the Gaza Strip?
This was the Gaza
Which
Strip.
Which meant what?
To the west was the disciples, to the east was the Rangers that grew into the P Stone Nation.
And the disciples would come over here, challenge the Rangers, and 8 of them got killed on the corner where those challenges took place.
Right.
But it wasn't just gangs shooting gangs, it was gangs shooting other people too. 20 years ago, the litany seemed endless to then Captain Buckney.
I can think of a robbery where the victims were made to lay on the floor and they were shot. I can think of 2 instances of where persons were dragged out of their house, one out into the alley. They bodily drug him out of the house into the alley, made him beg for his life, and killed him in cold blood.
There were somewhere between 70 and 80 people killed.
In some cases, the actual killing in Woodlawn was being done by children, recruited by the gangs for little more than the glory of belonging. A former gang member speaking on condition of anonymity.
They wanted somebody shot. They'd give someone a couple of peanut butter sandwiches and jelly and a couple of dollars.
How old was that someone who was doing the shooting?
Maybe 10, 11, maybe 12.
Then, as now, there is a logic in gang leaders using children as killers. Commander Buckney.
What we found out was that Jeff and the Main 21, they did very little of the dirty work. They usually put the 12, 13, 14-year-olds up to do the shooting and those kinds of things, because it was very unlikely that they would go to jail.
Jail was where police tried to put as many of the gangbangers as they could, but some religious and community leaders, like Father Tracy O'Sullivan and Charles LaPaglia, argued if people like Jeff Fort had the ability to lead and control literally thousands of young people, then why not try and teach him and them a better way?
Our position was very clear from the very beginning, that we weren't interested in being social workers dealing with all the bad things that they were involved in. We were interested in teaching that leadership to do positive things out in the community.
Our main goal at the beginning was to diffuse the violence, begin some positive alternatives, and to accept the reality of the organized structure that the gangs have and try to direct it in a positive and constructive way. And obviously that became very controversial.
So controversial that Jeff Fort and Woodlawn would become national news.
Will you state your name, please?
Jeff Fort.
It was a summer day in 1968 that Jeff Fort was called to testify in Washington, D.C. before an investigating subcommittee of the United States Senate. But why was a Chicago gang leader the focus of national attention and debate? To answer that question, one has to go back to Woodlawn. Bishop Arthur Brazier.
We were desperate. We were trying to do something about a situation that was literally destroying this community.
The The shooting, the killing, the turf wars in Woodlawn just would not stop. Those wars, in turn, spawned another kind of combat, a fight over how to stop the gangs. The battle lines were drawn, community leaders against politicians, cops against clergy, liberals against conservatives. And the lightning rod of this conflict was a man by the name of John Frye.
John Frye was a very prophetic man, a really, truly prophetic man.
We felt that Reverend Frye was very similar to Hitler.
It was John Frye who gave Jeff Fort's gang a home. John Frye was the minister at the First Presbyterian Church of Woodlawn, and he let the Blackstone Rangers use his church as their base of operation.
Reverend Frye gave us the use of the church, not willingly. We tied Reverend Frye up for 4 days. He didn't really want to bow down and give the church to us.
You physically tied him up for 4 days?
Physically tied him up and fed him.
For 4 days?
For 4 days.
Why?
He didn't want drugs and guns in his church.
And so John Frye, you're telling me, was afraid of you and let you have what you wanted?
The man was afraid.
Charles LaPaglia, Frye's associate, says that is a lie and that many lies were told about him and Frye and what was going on at the First Presbyterian Church. John Frye, meanwhile, would argue the gangs were not the problem in Woodlawn, society was.
I think that it is really society that is killing black people.
I think John believed that the Stones had some function beyond being a gang.
I don't think that they would have reached the significance they did had it not been for the First Presbyterian Church and the Reverend John Frye.
He believed that they could be a constructive force in their own community.
But could John Frye's vision of greater opportunity alter the course of the Blackstone Rangers and Jeff Fort? Father Tracy O'Sullivan.
I think John Frye was very creative and committed and a passionate sense of justice. At the same time, I think John Frye was not open to compromise, did not see the complexity of the situation, was not able to see that Jeff Fort and the others were not all good guys, that they weren't straight out angelic. I constantly asked the questions, well, fine, but what about the killings? That was the constant question we had. We never got to a point where the violence stopped.
My office was bombarded constantly by families, by clergymen, asking us what was TWO going to do about the gang problem. Every effort to break up these gangs, youth groups, they all failed.
So you were seeking some way to learn to live with them and for them to learn to live with you?
And so they could make a positive contribution to the community.
At the same time that John Frye was reaching out to the Blackstone Rangers, Arthur Brazier of the Apostolic Church of God had just become the head of the fledgling Woodlawn organization. Brazier's contribution was to get, despite the objections of Mayor Richard J. Daley, a federal grant worth $1 million. The idea was to use the money to teach both the Blackstone Rangers and the Eastside Disciples job skills, and to use the leadership of those gangs to help run the program, to try to channel that leadership into constructive avenues,
where they can be a benefit to the community rather than a detriment.
It was a bona fide effort to try to take these gangs that were shooting one another down in the street. The police were unable to deal with it, and to try to take them as they were and try to refocus their ideas on something much more constructive. It was an experimental program.
An experiment worth pursuing because the gang war was intense, because business was being extorted to pay protection to the gangs, because Woodlawn was overcrowded, in racial transition, and in turmoil. Something had to be done, but police were appalled at this particular approach, believing it was a naive, liberal solution to a deeply criminal problem. Chicago Police Superintendent Leroy Martin was a resident of Woodlawn at the time.
I guess some of the people were very well-meaning people, but they just created a monster
with the money that they gave them, no controls on it.
Police Commander Edward Buckney believed the gangs had become the darlings of liberal America, people who didn't understand the gangs' real motive.
They were in it for the money and whatever other gains could be gotten. You know, anytime you can have somebody like W. Clement Stone give them money, the Sears Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Weibold Foundation, the Kettering Foundation, and all of these kinds of things, and they would... You know, if somebody's constantly giving you money, do you ever think in terms of getting a job? Hell no. And they didn't.
Talk to me about money.
Money. I had a lot to do with getting money to the Blackstone Ranger organization. And if I have any shortcoming, I just didn't get enough money to the organization. Because what I got to them, they used incredibly well.
Ben Davis, a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago, was one of a number, including John Frye, who believed that police were oppressive, unjust, and only fueling the violence in Woodlawn. Some of the foundation money Davis would get for Jeff Fort and the Blackstone Rangers would be to bond them out of jail and hire lawyers for them. And you have any regrets about that?
None.
You had a lot of respect for Jeff Fort.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He is one of the rare human beings.
But the desperate search for alternatives only inflamed the situation. Jeff Fort and the Blackstone Rangers would use the First Presbyterian Church to make and store weapons. Police believe Frye and LaPaglia knew that.
No doubt about it at all.
There are still people today who claim, whether you knew it or not, First Presbyterian was functionally an arsenal. There were guns in there, that there were drugs in there, that there were illegal things going on in there. They're not entirely wrong, are they?
That illegal things probably went on. No, I'm sure there were illegal things that went on in there that we weren't aware of. I'm sure, you know, I mean, weapons were certainly something that was rampant in that community. But our position was to try and disarm and the kids and to cut the violence as much as we possibly can.
And what kind of weapons would you keep in that church?
Carbines, submachine guns, 9mm, you name it.
Meanwhile, over at the job training program, equally intense controversy. Gang members would be paid to come to a job training class taught in large part by gang leaders. There would be immediate charges of gang leaders getting kickbacks. When the gang members would go to these job classes, how would that work?
Everybody would go to school and get a check, and in turn they would kick back so much of their money.
So there was always a kickback.
Right.
Were there legitimately some kids in those classes in it to learn job skills who later went on to get jobs?
Yeah. Some of them was really serious about it.
Were any of the leadership in the category of serious, hardworking students?
No. Not that I recall.
The program just wasn't working. That was the conclusion of a study done by Dr. Irving Spergel of the University of Chicago. And the reason had as much to do with the adults as the gangs.
It seems to me that the most serious problem with that project was the context, in that you had major conflict among organizations.
For instance?
Well, you had some elements in the political structure that agreed with the project ideas and were supporting it, and some that were opposed to it violently.
Different political leaders had different points of view about it. There was a struggle on every level.
And the gangs had a field day.
Particularly the Black Pea Stone Nation and Jeff Fort, who, because of the Spergel study and because of the public outcry, would be brought before the McClellan Committee in Washington, a Senate subcommittee investigating whether $1 million in federal money had been misspent and whether Woodlawn had become a fortress for the gangs. Jeff Fort was called to explain himself to that committee. After stating his name, he walked out. In the years to come, he would be convicted of contempt of Congress charges and the misuse of federal money. But that would hardly mean the end of Jeff Fort or the debate over who he was. Social worker Charles LaPaglia.
I think Jeff was basically good. I think given the opportunity to achieve good things, he would have.
Police Commander Edward Buckney.
probably when he first joined maybe the group that they called the Blackstone Rangers, there may have been hope. But I think with the coddling and the publicity and all of the other things, I think it's probably a situation that he got into that was too deep and there was no way out.
Father Tracy O'Sullivan.
It became good guy, bad guy, and then people had to make Jeff Fort a great angel or a great devil. Well, Jeff Fort wasn't either an angel nor a devil. He was a human being, and he was talented, and he was moving in certain directions. We wanted to change those directions by opening up new opportunities and new resources. I think we all failed in that regard.
For Jeff Fort and his Black Peastone Nation, the late 1960s was a time when amazing things could happen. Just look and listen.
But the Blackstone Rangers are no longer a tough street gang. They are an example of what can be accomplished by the young people who live in the ghetto areas of our big cities and supposedly have no opportunity to get ahead in life. These kids got off the street and formed a musical revue company called Opportunity Please Knock. And they've been performing now for almost a year. I'm sure you're going to enjoy what they do. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the Blackstone Rangers.
In fact, these weren't Blackstone Rangers at all. They were simply the people Jeff Fort sent to L.A. to sing on the Smothers Brothers show. Once again, he controlled the situation. The late 1960s, it was a time when civil rights activist Jesse Jackson would confer with Jeff Fort and Mickey Cogwell, leader of the Cobra Stones. It was a time in which Illinois Senator Charles Percy would invite Jeff Fort to Richard Nixon's inauguration, even though Fort had just been to Washington, where he refused to answer senators' questions about his misuse of $1 million federal grant and had walked out on them. Jeff Fort's invitation came even after he'd been convicted of contempt of Congress for that. Jeff Fort decided to send fellow gang leader Mickey Cogwell to the inauguration in his place. It was a time some people considered utterly insane. Chicago Police Superintendent Leroy Martin.
To go out here and find a hoodlum off the corner and invite him to the White House, you desecrate the White House. I think it's absolutely outrageous.
But was it outrageous, or was it an attempt to enfranchise the disenfranchised? There were people, after all, who saw Jeff Fort with a different perspective.
They were poor. They didn't have anything. They didn't run any candy stores or cleaning shops.
They wanted to be somebody?
And they wanted to run it. That was their term. They wanted to run it.
Oscar Brown Jr., singer, songwriter, playwright, was born in Woodlawn.
Nobody wants to be broken, poor, beating everybody up and scared to death all the time. That's what it was about. They were scared of people. They were scared of each other. They were scared of what was going on, and they were scared of the environment in general. And so they became tough. They became something that was going to fight back. They were getting something that was going to run it. That had its own turf and it had its own identity, stone thing.
Oscar Brown Jr.'s idea to stem the violence in Woodlawn was to create a musical revue starring the Blackstone Rangers, providing them with an alternative to the street. It was an idea that allowed Oscar Brown Jr. to look more closely at Jeff Fort.
He reminded me of a very good, charismatic Baptist preacher in his approach to these guys. Brothers, where did you get those hats? I mean, wear those for your chief. He was like that. And he was an inspirational guy to him. I never got to see that in my general dealings with him because he was always usually pretty reticent. He was not a warm person in my relationship with him.
Jeff Fort wasn't a warm person in a lot of people's relationships. They would call him Angel on the street, and for many, he was clearly their leader. But his leadership was a function of fear.
You were afraid of him when he was an 11-year-old kid?
Yes.
He had a certain crazy look in his eye that would make you scared of him.
Some people are still afraid and speak from the shadows. Others are not. Again, former gang member Kenny Morrow.
The man is a vicious killer, a psychopathic killer.
Do you believe that Jeff ever participated in any of the killings?
Oh, yeah.
Police officer Richard Peck and gang member Kenny Morrow both clearly remember the day James Watusi McCain was killed in the apartment building that used to stand here at 42nd and Drexel.
When did it happen?
It happened on Christmas Day, 1968.
Jeff put him on his knees and made everyone walk by, and they kissed him on his forehead.
Kissed Watusi?
Kissed Watusi on the forehead.
Made him get down on his hands and knees and recited the 10 Commandments to him.
And the last man was Cornell Steele.
I heard he stuck the gun in his mouth.
And blew his brains out with the .45 pistol.
So it was the kiss of death?
It's a kiss of death, yes.
Officer Peck would have his own shootout with Jeff Fort's gang. It happened 4 months later, in April 1969, when a group of Blackstone Rangers lined Woodlawn Avenue.
And it was this building right here they were standing. And he looked at me and he says, Peck. And so then they started to shoot. And they were shooting at me underneath the car from the sidewalk there. And so when I got ready, they emptied their guns and they ran through that gangway.
How many times were you shot, officer?
15.
Well, it was a hit. The GIU was getting a little too tough on us.
The Gang Intelligence Unit?
The Gang Intelligence Unit. And Jeff said we had to get rid of some of them. And Peck was one of the top ones.
Did that shooting intimidate Peck? Did it slow him down?
It made him worse.
Who do you have most of the trouble from? Is it white policemen or black policemen? Black policemen.
The late 60s was a consciousness-raising time. It was a time of Martin Luther King and civil rights. It was a time of Lyndon Johnson and the war on poverty. It was a time to try and better the plight of America's underclass. One of the arguments that I get from people who to this day defend Jeff Fort is that even the black police officers of that time were more from the middle class, and they weren't any more interested in helping the disenfranchised than the whites in the community were. Is that fair?
Oh, no, that's totally unfair. What middle class? We're going back in the 60s. The black middle class, what there was made up of professional people, which police officers weren't a part of it. You go out there and talk to any police officers from that era, we were just poor guys that happened to get lucky enough to come out the Army and get on the police department. But that's totally untrue, that police officers from the middle class.
While the first generation of gang police officers, many of them black, were already working on the streets of Chicago, a second generation of officers, many of them white, was coming of age.
We'd had fights with them on the corner when some of the Carmel kids were leaving. They would get stuck up on the bus.
In the 60s, Rich Kolovitz was a student and a basketball player at Mount Carmel Catholic High School, located in the heart of Woodlawn. His best friend was Dan Brannigan. They did everything together, including fight the gangs. Was this strictly a white kid versus black kid kind of thing?
Back in the early days, yes, it seemed that way because of the atmosphere in the changing neighborhoods.
The tension in that changing neighborhood would never be more intense than April 5th, 1968, the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down in Memphis, Tennessee. The west side of Chicago was already rioting and burning, and the south side seemed to be next. And there was a serious question of safety for the white students at Mount Carmel.
The fear, the anger, the utter horror of the situation was beginning to come to us.
Father Tracy O'Sullivan feared there would be an assault on Carmel and a race riot, but there wasn't, and to this day he credits that fact to Jeff Fort.
He controlled the situation, he stopped violence, he controlled his troops.
Jeff did help the white kids get out of the neighborhood.
Did he do it, in your judgment, for altruistic purposes, or because there was some gain in it?
I personally, Jeff Fort doesn't do anything without the calculation of what he or his organization or his people, but mostly himself, is going to gain by it.
Just as they fought the Blackstone Rangers as kids, Rich Kolovitz and his best friend Dan Brannigan have pursued them as adults. In 1969, they joined the Chicago Police Department. As the 70s began, Rich Kolovitz and Jeff Fort were both 23. They were each just beginning their careers. And the era of the Blackstone Rangers, Black Pea Stone Nation, was about to end. They had begun to move from what had been called a youth gang into something much more sinister. By 1972, Woodlawn was a wasteland. Its business district shattered, its jazz clubs closed, its shops and restaurants shut down. The homeowners of the 50s who couldn't tolerate the gang violence of the 60s were gone by the 70s. Empty buildings, vacant lots, and broken glass told the story of their flight. With the 1970s came the end of Woodlawn, but only the beginning of Jeff Fort, even though he was sent to prison in 1972 for misusing federal money. He emerged 4 years later, even better prepared to lead. He was physically bigger, mentally tougher, and he would argue now spiritually inclined. Born a Mississippi Baptist, Jeff Fort in prison was reborn, not just a Muslim, but the leader of his own Muslim sect.
He'll always be the leader of the people.
His followers would be called the El Rukns. Jeff Fort would now be called both Angel and Imam.
I couldn't tell you absolutely one bad thing about Imam Abdul-Malik Abaye. Nothing. He's like a perfect angel to me.
What does he stand for in your judgment?
To me, he stands for evil.
Former police officer Arthur Lindsay remembers Jeff Fort from the time Fort was 12. And he remembers 1976 when Jeff Fort left prison and declared a new religion.
For the activity and to shield them from the law.
Protect them from the law, says Lindsay and many others, because the El Rukns were now a big-time criminal operation. In the next 9 years, the El Rukns would set up a fortress-like headquarters on Chicago's South Side with reinforced steel doors and windows. It was called the Fort. They would acquire a number of buildings, but shield the actual ownership in secret land trusts. They would start a security guard business. But above and beyond anything else, they would, according to authorities, deal dope. Marijuana, the heroin substitute teas and blues, and cocaine. But believing they were criminals and proving it were quite different things. Time and time again, Jeff Fort in the 1970s and early 80s would be arrested, hauled into court, and then released on insufficient evidence. Unlike other gangs, it was hard, if not impossible, to infiltrate the El Rukns. Former police officer Arthur Lindsay.
You could never get members to tell you about what was going on. They had a brotherhood. They were very loyal to one another.
We're not a gang, and a person just can't join us. You know, say like they cannot just leave their home and say, well, I'm going to go and join the El Rukns today. See, you have to be accepted into the tribe.
The El Rukns to this day function as a closed society, ruled, controlled, contained by Jeff Fort. These are home movies taken by the El Rukns for the El Rukns in the late 70s and early 80s. They show Jeff Fort sitting in a throne-like chair, wearing 2 large diamond rings and surrounded by his highest-ranking followers. Fort would title them generals. El Rukn women, in keeping with Muslim tradition, would be called Mobitises. And Jeff Fort's power was absolute.
It's been a whole misinterpretation of what Imam Malik, who you know as Jeff Fort. Mr. Fort has never given anybody in this organization, in this holy and divine movement, any instruction whatsoever except following the principles of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice.
How is it this holy and divine movement, as you call it, sees any number of weapons taken from its premises?
Those weapons that might have been here was clearly defensive weapons.
Officer Brannigan and Kolovitz had an informant who told us that there were two .45 semi-automatic machine guns, that they had been altered from semi-automatic to fully automatic.
By the time of this raid on the fort in 1982, officers Dan Brannigan and Rich Kolovitz had been working gang intelligence for 5 years. The El Rukns called them enemies of Islam.
These people are constantly trying to frame me in every type of way.
Jeff Fort rarely spoke to reporters, and with the exception of this 1981 impromptu news conference, never spoke in front of cameras.
It's getting to be a real sick problem with people that's constantly trying to use us as some political football.
But Jeff Fort and the El Rukns had political interests of their own. Though candidate Jane Byrne denied any knowledge of it at the time, one of her operatives paid the El Rukns $10,000 to campaign for her during the 1983 Chicago mayoral election. True to form, the El Rukns took the money but supported Harold Washington instead. Presidential politics interested them as well. In 1984, when Jesse Jackson became a candidate, El Rukns helped Jackson lead a voter registration drive and rally at Chicago City Hall. Supporters of the El Rukns have always argued, from the days of Mayor Richard J. Daley, when they were Blackstone Rangers, to the present time, that the El Rukns were crushed by establishment politicians who feared their power. Former social worker Charles LaPaglia. But you still believe that that they could have been a political force?
Yes, I do believe that they could have been a political force.
The authorities agreed the El Rukns were a force, but not political, purely criminal instead, wide-reaching and dangerous. By the mid-'80s, there was hardly an agency of law enforcement, local, state, or federal, that wasn't investigating the El Rukns, who by this time had been tracked to Milwaukee, Minneapolis, East Cleveland, St. Louis, California, Miami, and New York. Law enforcement could track them, but in the 9 years since he left federal prison, Jeff Fort still seemed to elude them.
Jeff Fort told me one time several years ago, I think it was about 1981 or 81, when he told me that Brannigan and I would never put him in prison. And I said, Jeff, just wait, it's coming.
He's a very good boy.
Annie Bacon is Jeff Fort's mother. You think God is on Jeff's side?
Yes, he is.
She brought Jeff and the rest of her family to Chicago in 1955. But it would be back down south in the family's hometown of Aberdeen, Mississippi, that Chicago police officers Brannigan and Kolovitz would finally nail Jeff Fort. Brannigan and Kolovitz made their case with wiretaps, secret recordings of Jeff Fort's telephone conversations with an Aberdeen drug dealer turned government informant. And so, in 1983, in a Mississippi courtroom, Jeff Fort admitted his guilt to the charge of interstate conspiracy to distribute narcotics. But then he fled the country, reportedly to Pakistan, to avoid imprisonment. Ultimately, though, he did return and turned himself in. It had taken 7 years, but in 1983, Jeff Fort went back to federal prison, this time to Bastrop, Texas. But even so, it still took only a telephone for Jeff Fort to reach out and touch someone.
The only mistake he ever made was using the telephone.
From prison, the pay telephone became Jeff Fort's instrument of power.
Yeah, ain't no problem. It ain't no problem. Our thing is that it's not no waste type thing like one can't draw.
Fort would call in, collect at the El Rukn headquarters on Chicago's South Side. He would speak in a convoluted code, a language designed to confuse authorities. His followers would listen on a speakerphone, sometimes for hours, as Fort dictated the group's every move. Even behind bars, Jeff Fort never relinquished control, and authorities never stopped their pursuit. As Fort was speaking, the government again was listening, and what it heard seemed incredible. U.S. Attorney Anton Valukas.
He was engaged in an attempt to perform terrorist activities against the United States for money.
After watching Muslim leader Louis Farrakhan obtain a $5 million loan from Libya, the El Rukns decided in 1985 there was money to be made in the Muslim world, and so they too reached out to Libya. But what they proposed was the selling of their services. For $2.5 million, they would, in behalf of Muammar Gaddafi, blow up buildings or shoot down airplanes in the United States. From federal prison, Jeff Fort oversaw the Libyan operation and determined the El Rukns needed bigger, better firepower to do the proposed job. The weapon of choice, a handheld anti-tank rocket launcher known as a law rocket, the type the El Rukns had seen in a Clint Eastwood movie. At a Southside tavern, a federal agent posing as a weapons dealer met with the El Rukns and arranged to sell them a law rocket. The sale went down at a Holiday Inn in a suburb south of Chicago. Early in the morning of August 5th, 1986, city, state, and federal authorities raided 2 El Rukn strongholds, seizing guns, drug paraphernalia, and the law rocket. The government had its case. The charge was conspiracy to commit terrorism. And in October 1987, Fort and 4 of his followers were in court. Jeff Fort would be the most unusual client defense attorney Terry Gillespie had ever had.
How would you describe him?
I would describe Jeff as a very intelligent, this will sound ironic, but my experience with him is a very intelligent, gentle man.
Do you think he's brilliant?
I think so, yes.
In spite of the fact that some people claim that he is not literate, that he is unable to read or write.
Well, some people may claim that he's not literate. I think very few that know him would claim that he's not a very intelligent man.
Gillespie would try and persuade the jury that Jeff Fort was a devout Muslim simply looking for a loan from Libya. The jury didn't buy it and accepted instead the prosecution argument of conspiracy to commit terrorism. It would seem they accepted as well the portrayal of Jeff Fort offered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Bogart.
I described Jeff Fort from the very limited perspective that I gained about him as a leader who had absolute control over the individuals who functioned in his organization.
Is he unique in your experience of criminal prosecution?
Jeff Fort is unique, yes.
Jeff Fort and 4 other El Rukns made history at the end of 1987 by becoming the first people to be convicted of conspiring with a foreign government to commit terrorism in this country. Jeff Fort was sentenced to 80 years, and he was sent to the toughest federal prison in the system, Marion, Illinois. But because prosecutors judged him to be dangerous even in prison, the court ordered Jeff Fort could have no contact with the El Rukns, not by phone and not by prison visitation. What those prosecutors didn't count on was that Jeff Fort, in a matter of months, would be back in Chicago and back in touch.
I would say that if ever there's a person going to hell, Jeff is one of them.
In your judgment, Jeff Fort has never committed any act that would be considered wrong, reprehensible, illegal, unethical?
Well, in my judgment, we'll be in paradise together.
El Rukn Lawrence Crowder and Police Commander Edward Buckney represent the debate that never died. Jeff Fort in the 80s is no less controversial than he was in the 60s. At present, Jeff Fort is back home here in Chicago in the Cook County Jail. The reason, he's on trial again, this time for the murder of a drug dealer. And because it's a state case, he's being housed with other state prisoners. The irony in all of this, the federal prison restrictions don't apply there. And there is every reason to believe that Jeff Fort is now back on the phone running his El Rukn organization from the jail. In 20 years, Jeff Fort has not yet been stopped. It's a different story for the community from which he came. Woodlawn was stopped in its tracks 20 years ago by the gangs it couldn't contain. There is still violence here today, but it is the violence of abject poverty and hopelessness. And out of that hopelessness, some fear new street gangs are beginning to emerge. For some of those who tried in the 60s to do something about Jeff Fort and Woodlawn, there is to this day considerable pain, but no lessening of the passion they felt 20 years ago. Charles LaPaglia, who worked with Fort at the First Presbyterian Church, now runs a West Coast jazz club.
I see him as one of the people, one of the kinds of bright, talented people in the underclass who tried to do something about his situation and was crushed.
Commander Edward Buckney now runs the training division for the Chicago Police Department.
I think we predicted
that if allowed to go unchecked, that they would eventually involve themselves in organized crime activities, which turned out to be very, very true.
Oscar Brown Jr. is still writing and performing.
These kids are Americans. They see the same thing everybody else sees. They see Ivan Boesky, you know. They see the whole scam that's worked all around. They want to be in on something big. I mean, these kids were the victims of something beyond them. They were born victims. They were in it. They were black and poor in America in Woodlawn when they were found themselves.
Rich Kolovitz and his partner Dan Brannigan are still Chicago cops detailed to the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which recently honored their work on the El Rukns.
They sell their narcotics to blacks, they kill blacks, they intimidate the black witnesses children over the years.
So you see them as an oppressor class in their own community, essentially?
Oh yeah, they're their own stormtroopers.
Leroy Martin, who lived in Woodlawn, became chief of Chicago's police.
That's Jeff Fort legacy, is to go out there and look at 63rd Street, and it looks like a bombed out street.
John Fry today has a ministry out in Oregon. He declines to speak about the 1960s Jeff Fort or Woodlawn. Tracy O'Sullivan is still a parish priest in Woodlawn, working with the poor.
It didn't have to be the way it was. And I prayed that it didn't have to happen this way. It did. It's tragic, it's sad, and the thing is that they're putting him in jail, and he organizes in jail. And they try to break up the El Rukns, they still keep on going. He is a powerful human being. He was and he is, and I don't think there's anybody that can explain that. And so the tragedy is that that power went in the wrong direction. And I feel very, very distraught and upset that it was a failure on our part.
And Kenny Morrow is now working for the government on drug cases against the El Rukns. He became an informant because he believed Jeff Fort and the El Rukns killed his brother and his best friend. Is there something that sets Jeff Fort apart from the people who led other gangs?
Well, he's a survivor. I mean, most of the gang leaders that I know are either dead or broken. He's never been broken.
He's going to be in jail possibly for the rest of his life, right?
Oh, he don't believe it.
He doesn't?
No. He got some people that would actually come there and break him out if he ordered them to. There's a lot of people that would risk their lives for him. A lot of people with him that's not afraid to die and not afraid to go to the penitentiary.
They will do anything for Jeff Fort.
He has that power over them.
Have you ever met anyone like him?
Like Jeff? Never.